Thanks, Dr. Griffin. Well, it's good to be with you today, and I know I'm what's holding up you between going home or going somewhere else. So believe it or not, I know this is hard to believe, you're going to have an elected official who actually will be short, and I'll be kind of brief. You know, I was looking this morning, let's see, today I got up, I had a speech in Austin that had to do with the legacy systems and where state government goes with the legacy IT systems we have and the problems that we have with that. And then I switched to going over to the office, and I was trying to catch up on what were the presentations that were provided during yesterday and today before I went back over to the Capitol to give a speech to a bunch of kids from over in Commerce, the university over there. They were in town, and so I wanted to talk to them, called the Blue Coats. So we had that opportunity and then drove over here. And so I've spent a little bit of time between my speeches as well as the drive over thinking about some of the presentations that were provided yesterday and today. And, you know, one of the things, Dr. Griffin and I were talking just a few minutes ago about where do we go from here, which is really what the point of that I'm supposed to talk about. And before I do that, let me stop before we go any more to water and turn back and look at where's Texas today from an economic perspective. And in the role that I have, as you know, 3 core constitutional duties, which ends up being running the state treasury. $108.5 billion a year flows through the state agencies, and we make sure to issue all of those 12 million payments, account for the dollars, make sure they're accounted for because it's your money, it's the taxpayer dollars, whether it's federal dollars, state dollars, or whatever the combination. And then you have the tax collection side. Yeah, I admit it, I'm the tax collector, which is ironic. My grandfather on my mother's side, he was a Baptist preacher. And I remember hearing in his sermons, they stoned the tax collector. And then little did he know, several years later, when his grandson was going to be elected official, he'd give the invocation at my swearing in for the tax collector. I was a little afraid of what sermon he was going to give that day, but he didn't go into the sermon, which I appreciate. And then thirdly, looking at the state economy, 12 economic regions. You know, Texas is pretty amazing to know when we had that downturn in oil and gas during 2015 and 2016. You know, Texas in the last 20 years has grown about 3.8% in GDP growth every year. And you go, what does that have to do with water? Well, I'm going to come back around here in just a few minutes. If you look at that GDP growth, that has actually outpaced the national average year after year after year. If you look at the last 76 months, yes, during that downturn in oil and gas and manufacturing, which are 2 of the largest industries for GDP contribution in the state of Texas, the fact is we lost 160,000 jobs. But amazingly, during that same time period, because of the diversity of Texas in job creation in different industry sectors, Texas actually grew jobs 72 out of the last 76 months. Isn't that pretty amazing? You lose 160,000 jobs in 2 industry sectors, yet you only lost jobs as a state 4 months. That's pretty phenomenal. And every day when you wake up, think about this in the morning. Think about it for the next few mornings. When you wake up, every single day, the day before, there's roughly another 570 people in Texas just based on natural growth. And then on top of that, or addition to it, there's roughly another 550 people that moved into Texas the day before. So every morning when you wake up, this has been going on for the last decade plus. It's projected to continue for the next several decades. Every single day, 1,100 more people in Texas every single day. And you wonder why we're talking about water. Oh, we can have the same conversation on roads. We can have the same conversation on a lot of variety of issues that we have to deal with. The complexity of the legislature being there 140 days every 2 years as policymakers, which is pretty phenomenal to think about that. I said this in one of my speeches recently. You know, it's amazing to know that Texas is the 2nd most populous state in the nation. We are the 10th largest economy in the entire world. I mean, right before we had the downturn in oil and gas, Texas was the 12th largest economy in the world, and I thought when I would get the economic data, looking at it, that Texas would probably had slid down from number 12, and no, I was wondering had we fallen below the economy of Australia, the economy of Spain, the economy of Mexico to our southern border, and in fact, no, we went from 12 to 10. You have a year where you have no growth whatsoever, you lose jobs in 2 of your largest industries, and you move to number 10? That's when people look at me and go, yeah, but Hegar, you're an Aggie, so did you use Aggie math? Well, no, the reality, it's pretty simple. The simplicity of it is that Texas has a diverse economy compared to the two countries is more diverse, and so therefore their contraction was larger than our contraction. And who are they? I'll tell you real quick and get back to the points of the speech. One is straight north of here. It's very cold in the wintertime. If you can't figure out for your geography, just north of the United States, Canada. And the other one is also very cold in the wintertime. It's not in North America. Part of it's in Europe, part of it's in Asia. If you can't figure out who it is, they're talked about in the national media almost every day for the last 3 years. If you're still not very good with geography, I'll give you another hint. The president just won re-election and he likes his photo ops without his shirt on when he fly fishes or ride horseback. Yes, that would be Russia. So if you can't figure it out, but think about not only 1,100 people a day, Texas has grown another 300,000 jobs in the last 12 months. Since the end of the last recession, 2007, we had the major downturn. In fact, Texas has gained over 2 million jobs, which is a quarter of the nation's jobs. Quarter of all the nation's job creation is right here. And so my point being is the pressure points on the state of Texas. And if you look at the state, I do think this is always interesting because I was involved in a lot of different water issues. And with some of the folks in the room, sometimes we were working together, sometimes we were on opposite sides. You know, my Senate district was west of Houston, south of College Station, south of Austin, back to the east of San Antonio and Corpus. And so I'm in the middle of big cities. Yet you got to figure out real issues. And as you saw in the last couple of days, these issues are very complex. Surface water is different than groundwater, the way it's treated. Some of it legislatively set up, some of it through the court system and precedent, some of it is fixed through the regulatory process, not just one state agency, multiple state agencies, river authorities, groundwater districts. You have things down where I call home in Katy, Texas, and in the Gulf Coast, a little thing called subsidence. Very real issue. That doesn't happen across the rest of the state. You go to the Edwards Aquifer area, which I represented a part of that. I was the downstream portion of it. And the fact is, you don't have that somewhere else. And so my point is this, as you've seen, Texas, yes, it's one big state, a really big state. And by the way, it has nothing to do with the speech, but if you ever want to run for statewide office, talk to me first. Talk to Commissioner Porter. It's a lot bigger than you think it is. Windshield time is enormous, so it may not be as quite enticing as you may think it will be. It's a big state, but when you look at water, it's hard to treat Texas as one state, is my point. And so I think if anything, how you take away is the complexities, and I think one of the things that looking through the presentations and talking to Dr. Griffin, talking to Ed a little bit earlier before I came on, you know, I think one of the things, I wasn't here, but I get the sense is a lot of the emotion was taken out, and water's real emotional. You know, you hear, I don't know about you, but I'm a big Willie Nelson fan. That's one of my favorite musicians and singers. And, you know, I love the old song Like Many, and you hear he sings about it, how, you know, water, that's for fighting over. Now, we don't have to fight over whiskey. We can drink that and celebrate together, but it takes water to make whiskey. And so water really is emotional. People get very emotional over it. I had a debate with a colleague of mine that I came into the Texas House of Representatives with in 2003, and we had a tough budget cycle. And during that budget cycle was talking about taking away some water money that would be used for brush control. And that brush control was in part putting more water back into the system. Areas that needed brush control that would add more water back in. And so I disagreed with us cutting that. He wanted to cut it, and I disagreed with that. So I was on the back microphone. I was asking him questions, and I said, Representative, I have a question. What is the one thing that we all can't live without? Being a good lawyer that Aaron Pena was, he avoided my question. Then I came back and asked again. I think by the third time he kind of paused and he said, well, the one thing we all have to have is love. That wasn't the answer I was looking for. The answer I was looking for was water. And he knew that. And he didn't want to answer the question that I was posing to him. And so I chuckled, kind of like you did, and I said, well, that wasn't what I was looking for. And he kind of smiled. He said, I didn't think you were. To his credit, I appreciate it. I still have it in my desk. He went back home to his district in Edinburgh, and then he brought me a little bookmarker, and on there it had love. So he found that, and he doesn't know, I still have that in my desk today from that debate and that conversation. But where I'm going with that back again is water. This conference here was taking the emotion out. But when you go back away from here, whether it's surface water, groundwater, whatever part of the state that you're in, it becomes emotional real quick. And you also have to deal with a lot of different issues, whether it's state law, dealing with one, state law, dealing with the other, whether it's the regulatory process, whether it's endangered species, a whole wide variety. And we haven't even got to the issue, and y'all talked about it though, with environmental flows and how do you deal with the Gulf Coast. Because I had a third of the Texas coast, and it's pretty important to me. It's pretty important to making sure those bays and estuaries have the health, and as you saw in the conversations, the health of the bay and estuary with flows to the east side of the state, all the way down the coast, down to Brownsville area, Padre, is very different. And so how do we make sure we deal with all those issues? And I guess one of the things that I would talk about is once you get in that legislative process, there is a lot of emotion. And I talking with Dr. Griffin, I think maybe Ed, you'd mentioned, said, yeah, well, they got to go back and get elected. And I said, well, it ain't elected that I'm worried about. It's all the tongue lashings that I take, and that I'm a little worried that I'm going to get shot, run over, or hung up in a tree somewhere. And you think I'm kidding. Try being an elected official and dealing with water issues. It's pretty rough. And so my point being is how do you have a conversation where you take out the emotion, and this is one of the things I mentioned earlier in my speech, as a former legislator for 12 years, 4 on the House side, 8 on the Senate side, is that you've got to be able to communicate with the membership, the policymakers, the ones who are going to be making the decisions on where we go. And as Glenn Hegar, I'm blessed to have a 13-year-old daughter, a 10-year-old daughter, and a 10-year-old son. So when I think about things, I'm not really thinking about what does it mean to Glenn. I'm thinking about what it means to the 7th generation of Hagars that are here in Texas. And what is Texas going to be? Because we know there's 1,000 people coming to Texas a day in natural growth or move-ins. We know that Texas is continuing to grow from a business perspective, yet whether it's, Steve, your area, where I used to represent, we move water from rural areas to suburban urban areas, and suburban urban areas is where a lot of the economic growth is. But at the same time, we've got to figure out how do we make sure that we have agriculture and production. Because I don't know about you, did you know every one of you eats every day? And so, and some more. I wasn't going to say that. But my point is that also leads to that emotion, not just from a national security perspective, to making sure, and especially if you look at the last several days, we're talking about a lot of term going out there called trade wars. And one of the first things we deal with trade wars when we have them, they don't come very often, is usually food. And so how do you make sure that you have a good, cheap, stable supply for the population, which is pretty critical? You know, when I see little kids that are not in rural areas, and I say, well, you know, where did that milk come? They're like, H-E-B? No, my question really was kind of like I was asking, what's the most important thing? And it was water, not love, but I guess love is, yeah, it's pretty important, but where did it come from? I meant the one before the grocery store. And so all I'm getting at is this. All of these confusing issues that are mixed in are very emotional. Away from here, it gets emotional. And so I think it's very critical that where we go from here, we know that we're going to have a growing state. We're going to know that we're going to have an extremely fast and hard time dealing with the water resources that we got. And so I think the biggest thing is every time you can take that emotion out, and whenever you can look at sometimes not look at it as a statewide, but look at it sometimes more regional. And how do you create a system to where you don't have winners and losers, you have winners and winners? That's the real issue. And you can have that, winners and winners. And I've seen that over and over in certain circumstances. And I think that's where you have to have the discussion. And, you know, I wasn't here for some of the legislators and others' discussions, but the fact is creating some type of system or better tweaking your system, and you're not going to change it holistically. Some like it the way it is. Some don't like it the way it is, but it's what they know. And we as human beings, we like certainty. And even if it's the creature we don't like, we'd rather have that than something else, because that's the one we at least understand and know. And so going forward, trying to make sure that we have winners and winners, that is the most critical aspect. And having a group like this and get together with very different opinions in a room is really critical if we're going to move forward as a state. Because if you know, Texas, the one biggest issue that I have a concern with is, yes, the growth is coming, it's continuing, but the real thing is when we don't have the growth anymore, do you start sliding backwards? And you've got to be able to not just meet for the next drought of record that will come or whatever issue we have, but how do you make sure you meet that supply? And you're going to have to do it with making sure that people have winners and winners in whatever system. So with that, I will stop. Questions, comments, complaints, anything from my friends in Bastrop County, Judge? Everything's good today. Well, it was good when I drove through it the other day. All right, I'm like an auctioneer. I will go once, go twice, and if there are no questions, comments, or complaints, then it is sold, and hope you all have a very good weekend. So thank you.